In today's lecture, we propose to examine the dynamic interface between development and the welfare state. I must explain why I call it dynamic, because the correlation between development and welfare keeps on changing and for a long time. Let us say from 16th century West Europe. Over time, the rate of dynamics has changed, to which we will turn much later. We must alert ourselves that between development and welfare, there are a large number of factors which intervene to give specific character to the nature of development or to the nature of welfare. To make it convenient, we will begin with certain elementary renderings and straight away ask a question: why in political science we discuss the theme at all? Because anybody would guess incorrectly that development refers primarily to the discipline of economics, welfare to public policy. So, why in political science? The answer to this question is critical for the discussion which will follow, for a very simple reason, that much of the dynamics I have talked about comes from political decisions by the state, by the ruling party, by the elite, by the globally superior power alliance. So, both development and welfare are embedded in politics. I must hurry to add that it can be embedded at the same time in something else also, obviously in economics or in culture or in the state of economic development in which welfare is introduced. You can't universalize. There is no stereotype, so to say. The first explanation why in political science is obvious, that development is largely state directed development, and it was so also in pre-modern times. That would have been the feudal state or the imperial state. But development has always been most prominent when directed by the state. And once again, the reason is simple, because the state commands the kind of resources like money or authority which non-state organizations cannot hope to. That being so, state stands out as the most critical element in all development and welfare programs. This is not to deny that beneath and beyond the state, there can be development initiative and there can also be programs of welfare. As an example of the second, we can always refer to the so-called NGOs, which produce enormous amount of welfare for targeted population. Even then, it does not amount to the kind of development work or the kind of welfare program the state can mount. So, normally we consider welfare to be politically defined, bureaucratically administered and publicly financed. That makes state stand out as the most important agency of both development and welfare. Even in present times, when due to globalization we suspect that the significance of the state would decline. It has not. To be more correct, we must say that the notion of welfare can originate in the larger polity, in the democratic process, in demand politics, or certain global standards like Human Development Index. But then to repeat the argument, even if there are global standards, even if there is civil society initiative, nothing can bypass the agency of the state. That was reason one, why it is in a political science curriculum. The second reason is this, and as located in the so-called third world, we probably feel every day, even when we read newspapers. Development and welfare involves choice, choice of models of development, choice of models of welfare. That implies that there are multiple paths to development and multiple possible programs of welfare. Why do I call it politics of choice? Because only some people ultimately decide what would be the model of development and what would be the welfare program. And thereby, some people are left out from contributing to the same question, what is development and what is welfare. That would automatically lead us to a question, who are these people who actually design development, who actually create welfare programs? Needless to say that only those who command power and knowledge, I repeat, power and knowledge, they are in a position to design development or to define welfare, or to abandon a chosen development path in favor of another, or reduce welfare. Let us give an example. See, in the first 4 decades after independence in India, we had what we used to call the socialist developmental model. And you all know that from 1990s, we have abandoned that particular socialist design in favor of what we call the neoliberal design. I repeat, even if you read the vernacular daily and without the advantage of a course in political science, you find the debate produced colloquially, which means in a language which the so-called laypersons understand. So, there is always politics of choice. To get back to the question, who win ultimately, they could be the ruling elite or the ruling political party. Usually, underneath them, a ruling class alliance. Feminists argue that even the male-centric state can also be far more superior in defining development and welfare even for the women folk. So, one can always locate a particular social group, a particular hegemonic social group which enjoys the freedom based on their power and their knowledge to design development and to design welfare. It does not mean that they always do organize development and welfare in favor of themselves only. It can also be development for the people. development for the people can occur under certain conditions or circumstances. Number one, the ruling group has a humanitarian commitment. Number two, that the ruling group has sufficient resources to move beyond their own group or own class to distribute people. Number three, if the civil society is very alert and the media is very free, then probably narrow political regimes in terms of the social composition are compelled to look beyond their own interests into the interest of the so-called masses. If it is a choice, and that is my third question in this particular branch, choice of what? Choice of the model of development. Historically speaking, we have encountered so far two models taken as pure types. Number one, the liberal democratic capitalist model, typical of Western Europe, North America, and in these days almost globalized. And the second model is the model of socialist, authoritarian, one party model. We had the experience of Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc socialist countries, China before 1980, and Cuba before Fidel Castro. But then these are pure types in the sense that nothing takes place that way without being compromised at particular stages. For example, liberal democratic capitalist model logically is to be the laissez-faire state, in which everything by way of economic decisions should be left to the market rather than the state. But even then we do discover that the liberal democratic capitalist model has been put under what is called state regulation. And in fact, the welfare state is one example of state regulation. So, historically speaking, that we do not have a pure model of liberal democratic path constant for a society for all time to come. If you look at the experience of socialism, they began with replacing the market by the state. They used to call it the command economy, pursued until the fall of Soviet Union and up to 1980s in China. But in China today, there is sufficient dose of capitalist practices, so much so, the global joke is this, that China is a capitalist socialist system. But in any case, the point is proved that there is neither a pure type called the liberal democratic capitalist type, nor a pure one party socialist authoritarian type, but you have mixtures of both, and the ratio differing from time to time and from nation to nation. This is likely to be true for all time to come. The third explanation why it is in a political science curriculum is this, that every choice means denial, which is, if I choose in favor of X, then I choose to deny Y. But then if Y would be a very sufficient segment of organized people, they normally contain and contest strategies of development and diminishing of welfare. So, both development and welfare are politically constructed, hence politically contested positions. and primarily because, and that is my final answer to the question why in a political science curriculum, that both development and welfare involve the question of social justice. This is how I would defend the lecture today. In the second phase of the lecture today, I intend to define certain key terms without which we cannot logically engage the interaction between development and welfare. I begin with the notion of development. Development, or the idea of development, has been taken over from the biological world. Biologically speaking, any organism which is born, given a chance to develop its full potentiality, it will reach a designed ultimate form, like myself, or like a plant, born, grows, matures, becomes old, becomes decadent, disappears. This is the biological thinking, or we call the organismic mode of thinking, and this notion of development has been taken over from the biological sciences and then supplanted to the social sciences. They are taken over by the social sciences, right, transplanted to social sciences. But all the social sciences have been affected by this biological metaphor, and the notion of development is thus defined. Development, when you use in social sciences, mean either and primarily economic development, and two, development of society and culture, and three, development of political structure, and finally, the development of the human person. So, development, unlike in biology, in the social sciences has been construed multidimensionally. There is no one single line of development. Development in one segment can influence, trigger, condition development in other sectors. Now, development apart from an economic doctrine, development is also a political ideology, which means that in the name of development, you can mobilize people. In the name of development, you can go into political struggle. And finally, we like to argue, as Amartya Sen would argue, that development is freedom in the sense that human freedom has only one foundation, which is development. The next key term has to be the notion of welfare. What does welfare mean? Welfare means a minimal level or standard of living. The moment I say the minimal level, I produce a question, who defines the minimal? And then we return to the same answer, that from time to time, those who are the masters of society, they define what is minimal. The minimal is defined, whatever it is, they define a definition for the time being, but then welfare also means targeted programs. Let us give example from the present times of India, the famous proposal that we transfer cash directly to those who need cash, rather than mediate cash through the panchayat or something like that, or it can be targeted policy, like say slum hygiene improvement program or the urban renewal program. So, the welfare is construed in various ways. The notion of welfare has again produced a counter notion. We call it ill-fare, ILLFARE. It is the opposite of welfare, and whenever we can point out that despite announced welfare policy on the part of the state, there is remarkable size of poor people, we say the welfare program was either mismanaged or it was not properly planned, which produces ill-fare. And what is much more ironic, that welfare state can produce ill-fare for its own people always. So, both going by the notion of development and going by the notion of welfare, we have argued hopefully, powerfully, that the notion of development and the notion of welfare are political notions. I have only one minor addition, that welfare can be as a part of a specific program, or it can flow from the overall economic planning process. Both are aspects of what is known as the developmental state, in a sense that welfare state and developmental state merge, and they have merged already. So, we now begin to pay attention to the meaning of developmental state. I mean, if you remember the contrast, namely the police state, which looks after law and law and order only, or the laissez-faire state, which leaves everything to the market, then the opposite notion is the notion of the developmental state. It can be strong interventionist state. It intervenes in economy and even non-economic spheres, and with regard to economy, it undertakes both macro and micro level planning. For that, the state must have two resources: one, a very efficient rational bureaucracy, and two, its ability to penetrate all social segments rather than remain confined to the metropolis. Given the historical experience of two models in West Europe and in the eastern part of Europe in the form of Soviet Union, we already know that it can take two particular special forms, and it can be a combination of both also. The best example of the combination is called the Keynesian state, after the economist Keynes, and Keynes inspired what is still more famous, called the Beveridge Plan of 1943 in England. I can tell you now that the heydays of welfare state was between 1945 and 1974, and the Keynesian model and the Beveridge Plan would belong to that particular period. This model involved the practice of a developmental state which would ensure, number one, high development, number two, high employment, number three, high taxes, number four, it must stabilize business cycles, and finally, what is very important, it must resolve distributional conflicts. So, what does it mean? It mainly means that the labor or the working class must be protected from the harshness of capitalism. In fact, the notion of welfare state became prominent only between 1945 and 1974. It became a global buzzword. The Beveridge Plan was a very carefully calculated plan to actually work out a kind of a compromise between capital's attention to profit maximization and labor's attention to adequate wage and proper working conditions. The Beveridge Plan and the Keynesian model both came to a close, say, from the middle of the 1970s, a period we also distinguish as a benchmark for the decline of the welfare state and the diminishing of the developmental state at the same time. In the entire discussion so far, we took the position of a historian in the sense that we argued that nothing is constant. The notion of development or the notion of welfare state or of the developmental state. This is easily understood because development and welfare set into motion other reactions also which promote or curb both the developmental state and the welfare state. In the next lecture, we will elaborate on how the global order, which is presently the neoliberal order, actually explains why there has been a decline both in the welfare model and in the developmental model, and by the logic of capitalism it cannot be otherwise. At least we will have to wait what kind of history the deprived people would produce, like let us say in Arab Spring or elsewhere where people can agitate, and they do agitate now, against faulty development designs and corrupt welfare administration. That way it is dynamics and dynamics all through. It is never a settled static question of development having an interface with welfare.